Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Tim Kirby Russia, where a strange man with a strange background and no accent in English, well, unless you're British, then I would have an accent, can tell you about what things are really like in Russia as someone who's worked in the Russian media for, what is it now, over a decade at a pretty high level. Anyways, guys, what I can tell you about is the upcoming Russian elections. But I think the best way to sort of look at these elections would be through the lens of the famous Russian philosopher who we mention often on this channel, because no one understands Russia. If you think by watching these videos I know something about Russia, no one knows the country as well as the professor and former professor and eternal philosopher of Russia, Alexander Dugin. And he said about the elections that essentially this time in Russia, the elections are going to be much more like sort of a referendum. And to an extent in the past, they sort of were as well. It's sort of a referendum of do I approve of the actions of Putin and the people around him, or don't I? That's really the way the voting is going to look. And with a high 70s, low 80s approval rating, ultimately this referendum is probably going to go through. Now, someone could say that it's a terrible thing that in Russia they don't change their leaders very often, and this isn't real democracy, this, that, or the other. And I think that's one of the reasons why Dugin called it a referendum, because he was sort of putting it in the context of this is the leader that people approve of. And if he wasn't able to get such high numbers, then things would be quite different. So, one of the problems is we get in these whole, what's democratic, what isn't, sort of debates is in Russia, generally leaders that have served for a long time tended to have brought the country more prosperity. But with the exception of not being able to create a proper heir for himself, Ivan the Fourth, also known as Ivan the Terrible or Ivan Grozny, was able to quite expand Russia, and he reigned for a long time, and his reign was considered successful. Yekaterina or Katerina II did the sort of same thing. She was around for quite a long time. Those are very prosperous periods. Even within the Soviet Union, a lot of people sort of considered Stalin who became sort of the glue against a lot of the Bolshevik and early counter-revolutionary excesses. If you look at things from the Russian history textbook standpoints, that his leadership brought the necessary stability to at least win World War II and stop the bleeding of the Russian Revolution. Because already by Stalin's death in 1953, things here were, let's just say, a lot more stable and beneficial to the population than they were in the early 1920s. That is not an advocacy for communism. I think communism has ultimately been detrimental to Russia, but I'm making a point that in Russian history, leaders that serve for a long time are considered winners that have done good for society. We could also say that even though some people criticize Brezhnev I forget even how to say it in English, but the Brezhnev period was seen as also being very successful because he was in power for a long time. How many years? I don't know, 15 or something, or more maybe. And that was seen as being very stable. And although in some ways it kind of maybe did not have that, too much stability when you're fighting a Cold War can be a little bit not to your benefit, but still people see that period of time as being very beneficial. And so when people in Russian history look at sort of the opposite of periods of when the leaders change really fast, and that there's a lot of chaos, well, then you're kind of getting into the early 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, where there was the putsch or whatever, and Gorbachev chose to retire, and then here comes out of nowhere Yeltsin, and the 1996 elections, the United States even said outright that they manipulated. So as soon as you get into leaders changing a lot in Russia, things are chaotic. Or like I mentioned with Ivan the Fourth, he was unable to secure an heir to continue his line, and that's where you get this whole thing of these different false Dimitris, as in his son being named Dimitri. So you have these false heirs to the throne, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth coming into Russia and all this other stuff. Definitely seen as a bad time as leaders changed a lot. And of course, the backstabbing and inner betrayal of the Bolsheviks during like the 1920s was pretty palpable. I mean, you know, Stalin was able to become a stable leader by taking out people like Trotsky. So, you know, if you look at things in those terms and sort of this global look at Russian history, and you know, tell Russians, your system isn't democratic if you don't change the leader every 8 years or whatever. It doesn't really match up with Russian history. It almost seems like you're shooting yourself in the foot. It's kind of like what the way Russia is. You know, if you have a winning horse, you know, you got to stick with them. You know, it's kind of like Russia kind of sees it like, hey, if Tom Brady's already won 3 Super Bowls, you know, who knows if he's getting older? Let's just keep him and see if he can win 3 more. You know, that's more their attitude towards things. And as sort of a counterpoint, we've had a particular Western leader who was in power for a long time, was Chancellor Angela Merkel. And so I bring this sort of argument up, is I believe she was in power for 19 years. And so when people say, it's not democratic if you don't constantly change your leader. So the thing is then, so does that mean that because Merkel's in power for 19 years, did that mean that at some point she went from being a democratic leader to an undemocratic leader? And if so, at what point? Like the halfway point? Was it 9 years? Or was Putin democratic at the 19-year mark along with Merkel? And then as soon as she quit and he went on to 20 years, that meant he was not democratic. And then conversely, too, well, you know, in the United States, the presidents are allowed to have 2 terms. Well, would it make things more democratic if they only had 1 term? Or if we voted every year for president? See, when you kind of step back from this just established norm that you have to rotate heads of state or else everything goes to hell, you kind of see that it's not quite so clear cut. And furthermore, if you look at the United States, where the at least the president, not so much the senators, Joe Biden, Lindsey Graham, what was his name, John McCain, well, even some people who are in Congress like Ron Paul, which is a good one, but he was in there forever. You know, so sort of the people in Congress, they don't change very much. Some do. But the president does change a lot, but then foreign policy doesn't change very much. So, you know, that's kind of thing where it's like, okay, we can play musical chairs all we want between the Democrats and Republicans, but if it doesn't really affect important things like foreign policy, then these superficial changes don't matter. So it's just kind of some things to think about when you're going into this Russian election that looks a lot more like a referendum. Now, what does this look like on the inside? Because if you're watching this channel, you're probably curious about some more, you're either fascinated by the strange man that I am, or you're interested about what it looks like, what things look like on the inside from Russia. So, obviously, this time, during the middle of a war, during the absolute possible peak popularity of President Putin, and after the unfortunate death of people's hero, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, and the just fact that Zyuganov of the Communist Party has lost many times and he's too old and hasn't really been able to find a successful successor to replace him. There's not a lot of competition. The only person who's kind of sort of really advertising is Slutsky, who took over for Zhirinovsky. But I don't think he's quite created much of a persona for himself, other than he's like, hey, I'm kind of the top of the LDPR party, and I'm important. Look at me. So I think in some ways he's kind of positioning himself for his own political career to go somewhere at some point in some time, maybe in the future. Okay, I'm not sure, but Slutsky is quickly becoming a household name. He seems to be fairly tall, which helps. He seems to be fairly normal looking, because, you know, if someone looks weird, it is hard to really elect them, and he looks very sane, which is a good thing. So he's really sort of the only person who's kind of trying to do anything, but he isn't really trying to win. He's just trying to sort of pump himself up. There are, of course, a couple clown candidates from some tiny minority parties that won't even get 1% of the vote. And, of course, you have at least one woman, I forgot her name, some kind of liberal freak who wants to give the Crimea away. So there's always one of those, at the very least, sort of a Navalny in a skirt. Yeah, so ultimately this isn't going to be a high competition election, and it doesn't really need to be, because again, like I just said, the overwhelming majority of people think the country is more or less on the right track, and things are being handled in the right way. And if things are working, and you view things from the standpoint of Russian history, then you don't really change them. And so that's kind of what is happening now. Now, I think after this election, if Putin is getting pretty old by this point, what is he? Almost 70? Is he 70? At this point, he's getting on in years. And so this is probably going to be his last term. And I think he needs to, because he knows Russian history. He certainly talked to Tucker Carlson about that Russian history a lot. He should know, he should look back at the time of troubles caused by the inability for Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, whatever you want to call him. Remember, Ivan is actually Ivan in Russian. But whatever you want to call this guy, he failed to get his line of succession in order, and it screwed up everything. You could also say that in a lot of ways, because Stalin was unable to find a success for himself, whether you think it's due to paranoia or whether he was short-sighted or whatever, Khrushchev, like him or not, agree with him or not, came in and sort of undid a lot of the work that Stalin did immediately. Because Khrushchev came from a quite different viewpoint on a lot of these issues. And we could go back and forth throughout Russian history, but in general, if you don't line up your successor, then a lot of the work that you've done or given your life to could be deleted like that. So I really hope that President Putin right now is sort of cultivating, curating. What would be a good word for that? I kind of like cultivating, but I think curating might be a better word. Cultivating or curating new candidates who could potentially be the people to take over for him. Some people might say Medvedev, but you have to remember Medvedev is getting on in year as well. And I think he's kind of happy on the Security Council. So where I do think, though, where I would actually make my, as I mentioned here, if I were to make $100 bet, like I often refer to on this channel, I would bet that the person who would then be the one in the top tier candidates to take over for Putin are going to be the guys who served in the special military operation. We've had a lot of politicians on sort of like the state level, some on the federal level who had a military background actually go and fight. And obviously those guys who actually during a war for Russia's survival went there and risked their lives or potentially, who knows, lost an arm or lost a leg, when they come back, they're going to certainly have a lot of clout. And it's going to certainly be pretty good evidence that, they did their part for their country. And so I have a strong feeling, and I am willing to bet $100 that whoever Putin does pick as his successor is going to have some deep ties to the special military operation and the whole Donbass situation. It could even be someone like, one of the heads of like the Donetsk or Lugansk People's Republic, like some of the politicians from down there who actually, at great risk, because remember, all the heroes of like the Russian Spring in 2014, 2015 were all assassinated. So there was a real assassination risk for any of those, politicians down there. So who knows, maybe one of those politicians who was able to sort of survive being assassinated, grinded out all those years, stayed down there during the war. That's pretty good proof positive that that person is quite committed to this whole great Russian world and ideas and all this other stuff, that they are a true patriot. Because again, we always have to be afraid that, like that cliche that, fascism will come wrapped in the American flag. Well, ineptitude in Russia can be wrapped up in a lot of flags and letter Z's and all sorts of cutesy poo memes. So, I'm pretty sure that Putin is going to pick someone who put their money where their mouth is. In fact, just the other day, it was sad, but this guy I think would definitely fit that. I was at an event at the State Duma, and I saw this guy who's even taller than me. I'm pretty tall. I'm 6'1", and he must have been 6'4" then. Also built like an American football player. Huge guy, definitely younger than I am. Booming, powerful voice, which I lack. I wish I had some sort of like, stadium shaking voice. But, freshly missing one leg. But it was, it's sad. And it's really sad to see someone that, physically fit, that tough, still in the prime of their life, now going around on crutches. But on the other hand, that's the kind of guy who's probably going to be a very good leader, well, at least on, in certain aspects. Because again, one of the problems is if you have everyone be a military leader, things from a military standpoint don't work good. Maybe so much in the Department of Education. But anyways, in a broad sense, I think that's probably that guy that I saw with one leg. He's probably the kind of person that they're going to be looking for future political office, or maybe to replace Putin himself. So ultimately, I really think that if I'm still alive in what will it be 6 years, I am pretty sure that Putin's going to call it quits. He's pretty strong. He seems in good health, but I think he's going to be completely worn down by that point. And maybe if there wasn't a war on, or if this war had already ended at some point a couple years ago, or he may have even called it quits now. But he doesn't have much choice. He's the emperor, and he has to stay on the throne until this major issue gets done. Then he can play around with trying to promote people. Because, again, what he did with Medvedev during the tandem era, whoever Putin actually selects and gets the proper promotion, as long as the people don't reject them. Because the people could reject them. This person could be a complete failure. It's kind of like in professional wrestling. Sometimes the management picks the wrong wrestler to promote and the fans don't accept them. But as long as the fans, as in the Russian citizenry, more or less accept the guy, it's pretty easy to be promoted when Putin says, hey, this is my guy. He's going to be in the next election. Vote for him. And hopefully that'll happen because it'll maintain stability, which is critical at this point in Russian history. And generally, kind of with the exception of the Brezhnev period, has been a real boon to Russia in the past. So stability going forward. So don't expect anything really radical to happen at these elections. There might be a few goofy protests that are funded by, let's just say, foreign money cookies. But ultimately, it's just going to be a sort of referendum, and a referendum saying, do you approve of Putin's reign or do you not approve of Putin's reign? And the overwhelming majority of people do so. So there you go. That's what's going to happen, and that's how I'm going to vote.